An important milestone was reached this week when the United States Congress passed and President Joe Biden signed a law designating June 19th, Juneteenth, as a federal holiday. There's an important backstory that goes with the Juneteenth holiday, and we're proud to bring that backstory to you this evening through the voice of Dr. Darrell Millner, Professor Emeritus of Black Studies at Portland State University, who will share with us some different perspectives on what Juneteenth is, how slavery legally really ended in this country, and where we need to go next. Here's Dr. Millner.
Juneteenth started as a local celebration of the moment in Texas history when the Union Army arrived and, for all practical purposes, delivered the reality of Lincoln's proclamation that slavery would be ended in all of those parts of the country that were disloyal to the Union on January the 1st, 1863. General Gordon Granger came to Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, made the pronouncement that now the Union Army was in control of Texas and that the proclamation would be enforced from that point on. And of course, the local blacks were overjoyed to finally get the opportunity to have a taste of freedom. It probably was not the first they had heard of that coming possibility. The slave grapevine everywhere in the South during the Civil War was very effective, and information about the war was widely available to blacks in the South, and Texas included. So it was probably not the first time they heard of the possibility that their freedom would arrive with Granger and his army, but it was the first time that they actually had to feel, and it had the effect of being a material reality for them for the first time on June the 19th, 1865.
How then did it grow from a local observance in Texas there in the 19th century into what has now emerged as a national commemoration?
Well, the original celebrations were not called Juneteenth. The first one was held in 1866. It's not until about 1903 that the term Juneteenth is applied to the celebration. And that corresponded with the beginning of what we call in American social history, the urban migration of blacks out of the South into the West and into the northern cities of the country as racial circumstances and really the economic and social circumstances of the country begin to change in the early 20th century. And as blacks migrate from Texas to other parts of the country, the celebration migrated with them. And because it's always nice to have a holiday, and I take all holidays, it became a fixture in black communities in many other parts of the country as well. But it originated as a local celebration, basically in Galveston, and then spreading to Texas, and then to the rest of the country.
Did June 19th, 1865 actually mark the end of slavery of blacks in the United States?
No, it didn't. And that's the reason why, for a person who teaches black history in the context of race in America today, the Juneteenth celebration that we are now going to be experiencing on the national level offers some positive points and some points of caution. If you teach black history in this country, especially in our current racial context, one of the things that you're always aware of is you cannot afford to make mistakes. People tend to look at black history as a topic that always has to be correct. If you make any mistakes in the presentation of black history, people now have an opportunity to dismiss it all. And that's constantly on the mind of a person in a position like myself who teaches black history. And Juneteenth especially represents a situation in which it's easy to violate that basic dictate of teaching black history, because the celebration itself arose not from the academic world, not from the world of research and the study and teaching of history, but as a community celebration. And it reflected those community origins. And consequently, sometimes the overall and the larger history of emancipation and the end of legal slavery in the country is a bit lost in the celebration of the Juneteenth event. And I think the significant thing to remember about Juneteenth, and also about the way that we teach Black history and really any history in America, is that we have a tendency to both simplify and sanitize the history that we present, especially the racial history that we present. And that has, I think, been reflected in the way that Juneteenth has been selected as the kind of symbolic end of slavery in the country. Legally and practically, the real end of slavery in American history was the adoption of the 13th Amendment in December in 1865, almost a half a year after the Juneteenth celebration. And it represented a good deal of irony in terms of how slavery ended, both in the North and the South in the country. Most people who approach the topic of the end of slavery are familiar with the common symbolic touch point that is a part of the way that we present that part of American history. And it's an association with Abraham Lincoln, who we've labeled the great emancipator, and I think justly so, and a proclamation that he issued first in September of 1862 to go into effect on January the 1st, 1863. What Lincoln did with his first preliminary and then final proclamation was to tell the Confederate states who were trying to leave the Union and form their own country based on slavery, that if they insisted on maintaining their desire to leave the United States and create their own country, then on January the 1st in 1863, their slaves would be free. If they remained loyal to the Union or came back into loyalty to the Union in the 3 months between September and January, then they would be allowed to keep their slaves. And so it was an offer that he made to them that they eventually declined, but it was a military decision that he made. It was an executive order. Now, so that compromises and makes difficult to understand the context of how slavery is going to end in this country, starting with that military proclamation. Now, Lincoln was never fully confident that a presidential declaration like that could legally end slavery. And that's why he wanted to pursue a change to the country's constitution that eventually becomes the 13th Amendment. And immediately after his proclamation is issued, he begins work on adopting that 13th Amendment so that it will become a part of the fundamental law of the land, rather than just a presidential proclamation. So we have, after the proclamation goes into effect, a very ironic situation in the country. The slaves of the disloyal population and part of the country are now, as far as Lincoln was concerned, technically free, but they weren't practically free. And practically free would only come when the Union Army reached the area in which they were in residence. That was the only way that Lincoln would have now control over their eventual fate. Now, the other compromising problem was that although we often present the Civil War as a battle between the slave states and the free states, there were actually 4 slave states that remained in the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. They were states in which the proclamation did not touch the black population because those states were still loyal to the Union. So technically, the slaves of the disloyal part of the nation were actually free before the slaves of the loyal part of the nation. And in the border states, in 1865, there were approximately 1 million black people that were touched by being left out of the proclamation. So slavery ended in a piecemeal fashion. And the last slaves to be freed were not the slaves in Texas or the slaves in any part of the Confederacy. They were the slaves in Kentucky and Delaware. Kentucky had probably as many as 100,000 slaves in 1865, Delaware about 1,000. So to fully understand the end of slavery, you have to understand the details in how that event unfolded. And it's important to remember the difference between an event and a process. Juneteenth was an event that we can symbolize and use as a symbol for that important turning point in the lives of many black Americans at the time of the Civil War. But it's not a definition of how the institution of slavery ended in the state. To fully appreciate that, we have to acknowledge what a difficult decision that was for the country to come to. The proclamation itself was passed and adopted by December of 1865, but it was a process that took well over 2 years, and it was a process that almost didn't happen. Lincoln is not the great emancipator because of the Emancipation Proclamation. He's the great emancipator because of the political work that he did between April of 1864, when the Senate adopted the 13th Amendment, and January of 1865, when the House adopted. The political struggle that took place in the House in that 6 or 7 months was tremendous. And it was the trench warfare, the hand-to-hand infighting of political warfare that Lincoln's administration was able to apply to that effort that finally meant that there would be an official end of slavery in the country. And so I think we have to acknowledge that that's really what made Lincoln the great emancipator. But we also have to acknowledge the difficulty of that achievement. In the House vote in January of 1865, it was required that the amendment receive 117 votes in favor. In the final tally, they only got 119, and that's how close it was. And that's how close we came not to ending slavery in that Civil War conflict. So to fully understand the significance of the end of slavery, we have to recognize, first of all, how difficult it was, and that simply recognizing kind of a symbolic event like Juneteenth is not going to give us the kind of momentum and the kind of commitment and motivation we need to fully recognize the legacy that slavery still has on the generation that we live in today. To do that, we have to understand the difficulty and the complexity of how slavery legally ended in the country. Now, Juneteenth in comparison, I think the most reasonable comparison I could make is with the 4th of July. The 4th of July is a symbolic representation of the creation of this country. It's based on the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But of course, this country was not created in 1776, and it did not get its independence in 1776. What happened in 1776 was that the 13 original colonies declared that they wanted to be free. They still had to fight a war for the next 5 years. They still had to negotiate a peace treaty with England that took a further 2 years. And they still had to experiment with government that took the next 7 years in a period that we call the Articles of Confederation. The United States of America did not begin in 1776. It began with the first administration of George Washington in 1790. So I consider Juneteenth to be that similar kind of symbolic representation of an important turning point in American life, but it was an event. The end of slavery was a process. It was a process that we still are involved in, because the legacy of slavery is what this generation has to be most concerned with, not necessarily the legal end of slavery. And it's so important to understand that the end of slavery was a process, because in terms of the issues of race that we face today in the country, we are entering really the most difficult part of our task in addressing that legacy of slavery. And people might, they might wonder, well, wasn't it hard enough before? And certainly it was. And lives were sacrificed, and lives were lost, and careers were lost. And all of those victories that we won between the end of the Civil War and the generation that we're in today, those were hard fought and well-deserved victories. But they represent a different kind of problem in terms of the legacy of slavery. The problems that they represented were very visible. You could see a white-only sign. You could see a sign that said blacks need to sit at the back of the bus. You could see those kind of very visible reflections of the Jim Crow realities that come into place after the Civil War, not before and not during. Mm-hmm. And those kind of battles are different battles than the kind we are faced with today. Everyone is familiar with the George Floyd situation that we recently passed through. And the great ally that the black experience had, and those people who are in favor of racial progress in the country had, was technology. We had that as an ally in all of the battles in the first stage of our battle against the legacy of slavery. So the automobile gave mobility to a black population that could spread Juneteenth around the country. The airplane made it possible for black people to leave the South in a more efficient way. Television in the 1960s made the civil rights movement a national event, not just a local affair in terms of the southern part of the country. All of those technological developments helped us win those battles. The most recent one is the best example of that. When people could see that knee on that neck and see a murder committed in front of their own eyes, because of the new technology that we have in the cameras and the internet and the web and all of those things that made that vision a worldwide experience, that helped us reach the point that we are now. But we have to move beyond that point, and that's why this particular event is so dangerous in many ways. It can be a reflection of what we might term a superficial victory rather than a substantial victory. And in the next phase of fighting that legacy of slavery, we need substantial victories that are not going to be helped by the kind of technological advances that we benefited from in the past. Now, when we talk about race, because we are entering that next stage seriously, we talk about phrases like systemic racism, institutional racism. Those are not things that you can catch on a camera. And that's what's going to make the next stage of our struggle so much more difficult and so much more important. And the reason that's connected to the Juneteenth celebration and understanding the real end of legal slavery in the country is those systemic issues, those institutionalizations of racial patterns and dynamics were created not during slavery, but after slavery in the Jim Crow period. And they are the reason why I think it's legitimate to say that the South lost the Civil War, but won the peace that followed. It was their pattern of behavior that became the generalized pattern of racial behavior in the country. And those were the things that were put in place in that first generation after slavery was ended. That's a crucial period in the development of the country, when all of the major institutions that are going to define American life in this generation are being created. Free public education, large-scale capitalism, monopoly capitalism, all of the institutions that are going to define the academic disciplines that people study when they go to college today. All of those are invented in the age after the Civil War, when Jim Crow is going to be implanted and infused into the institutions of American life. The next stage of our battle is to root those infusions, those aspects of Jim Crow racism that were infused into our institutions. We have to bring them to the surface and we have to address them, just as we've addressed the issues of the civil rights period and the technological period of George Floyd that we're recently passing through. So for those reasons, it's important to acknowledge and to understand the difference between a symbolic holiday like Juneteenth and understanding the actual process of how you end an institution like slavery that existed for essentially 3 centuries before it was eradicated. It would be unrealistic to expect that a legacy that long and that powerful would not still be impactful in the society that we live in today. And so we have to recognize that transition, and I consider it to be the most important transition in American racial history, from when slavery was legal to when slavery is not legal, as a beginning point of that process of addressing that legacy. It will take us a long time and hard work and probably more lives lost and more careers lost, but it's the kind of commitment that we have to make in this generation. And the Juneteenth acknowledgement that President Biden recently signed, I think is just the first step in making that kind of recognition and making that kind of commitment.
Dr. Darrell Millner, Professor Emeritus, Portland State University in Black Studies. Then briefly, what does the future then look like in your view as we summarize and end this segment?
This might sound a bit naive, but I remain optimistic. And I think black people are a tremendously optimistic group. They have remained optimistic and a part of trying to turn this country into the country that it said it wanted to be at the beginning. And I think we will continue to be that way. I also think that most people in this country, as far as race is concerned, want to do the right thing. Sometimes it's hard to recognize what the right thing is. And so I think that's our task in the immediate future and perhaps even in the next generation. We have to be able to look at that legacy of slavery that legally ended with the 13th Amendment's adoption back in 1865, and then we have to find the ways that it still has an impact on racial behavior in American life today, and then we simply have to do the right thing and be confident that most Americans want to do that.
Dr. Darrell Millner, thank you, sir.
Thank you.